Yeah. I suspect many of them would be happy to tell you how many people they want to kill, because it's not an accidental side effect of their policies. If the intention is to depopulate the planet, ethanol fits right in. I want to switch gears a bit and discuss the strategic situation, because there is a very significant shift going on in the response of the Congress, which I think is important for getting these economic policies put through. But on the subject of Benghazi, Syria, and then Russia, at the time that Gaddafi was killed, you had said that the next immediate targets would be Syria and Iran, with the real goal of causing chaos and conflict with Russia, which is a conflict that serves no legitimate American interest, but a geopolitical one instead. So, just on Benghazi, the situation with Benghazi, that's still red hot in the Congress. At least that's what we found with the hearings the last week, where the questioning was shaped by the report that we had put out and that we had gotten out in D.C. about how basically the same al-Qaeda groupings that were involved in the original 9/11 they were used in places like Libya. They now are operating against us in Syria. This is tied in with the killing of Ambassador Stevens. But you ask yourself, what is the possible benefit of involvement in Syria? Where is this supposed to go? What good could come out of toppling Assad and putting in place a new regime approved by the U.S.? Well, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, said that if there's to be any sort of new government, there has to be a broad negotiation. Rebel groups, the current government need to sit down, they need to negotiate, which is not something that the U.S. has said. Instead, U.S. officials have said that Assad is going to go, that the rebel groups don't have to discuss with the current government, that they should basically be given political control. Now, there is an interesting article written by Chris Hedges called Egypt's New Pharaoh, where he recounts what's happened in Egypt. You know, you've had the whole Arab Spring, we've had some time to see how things sort out. What's been the upshot? What took place in Egypt? Well, Hedges writes that the moderates, who are crucial to winning the support of the masses and many outside of the country, become an impediment to the consolidation of autocratic power. Liberal Democrats, intellectuals, the middle class, secularists, and religious minorities such as Coptic Christians were always seen by Morsi and his group as useful idiots. They were essential to building a broad movement to topple Mubarak, but now they're a hindrance to single-party rule, and these groups are being crushed. The Muslim Brotherhood doesn't intend to dilute its power, and secularism is on the wane, as poor believers are brought into the streets to attack the new enemies of the revolution, so-called. It's like the French Revolution, not exactly a dazzling success. So you'd say, what are we hoping to achieve in Syria? What better future are we trying to offer to the Syrian people? And then think about Turkey, where these 3 batteries of Patriot missiles are on the way to be established in this region that has little to do with defending Turkey from Syria, as obvious to everybody looking at it, but it's targeted at Iran. And if you think about it, you've got Russian military defense systems in Syria. Like the Patriot batteries, these are likely manned by Russian soldiers. So the potential for the direct causing of casualties of Russian soldiers exists. What would be the consequence of that? So basically, to ask the question on Russia is, going back to what you had said that I'd quoted in the beginning about after the murder of Gaddafi, the U.S. is operating under this Tony Blair responsibility to protect outlook. And this is just heading for a serious collision between the U.S. and Russia. This spells for the potential of use of thermonuclear weapons. So, could you speak to the motives that are lying behind what appears to simply be a completely senseless, insane, and useless policy on the part of the United States?
One of my specialties for a long time in intelligence work has been based on the role which led the great Chancellor of Germany out of office and thus set into motion what became known as World War I. Bismarck. Bismarck had, at the time of relevance, 2 years before his ouster, had been the keystone in preventing the foolish old doddering Kaiser of Austria from starting World War I as a Balkan War. And what happened is Bismarck, who was very well tuned in to Russian connections and who was much more trusted by Russians than any other person in Germany, particularly any other official person, just got in a position where they, that is Bismarck and the Tsar, the Tsardom, under two Tsars, had assured Russia that Germany would not participate, would not support, and would not tolerate an effort by the British to organize the silly old Kaiser of Austria together with other elements in the Caucasus, or not in the Caucasus, but in that area. That was the peace. That Bismarck had blackmailed the British government, regime, into not going to war, because he made that war not feasible by having a cooperation agreement between Prussia and Russia. So what the British did is they got a new Kaiser in, replacement for the old. And the new one, after a short period of time, dumped Bismarck. Within 2 years, the removal of Bismarck set into motion the beginning of World War I. And that continued with a little regression there for a moment in the 1920s, leading into World War II along a similar line. What we're doing now, if you look at the history of warfare, modern warfare in Europe and beyond, in terms of world wars and reference points in between, you'll find there's a continual process, which is repeated now 3 times. One, from 1890 through World War I, with a respite in the 1920s. World War II launched effectively during the course of the 1930s, and that went on as indicated. That was continued under Truman, by Churchill and Truman, which prevented an effective peace from being established. So we had these right-wing movements in the United States which terrorized the United States, its population, and then in comes a president, Kennedy, who is sponsored to be elected by Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Shortly after that, powers that be in London and in the United States killed Kennedy. They assassinated him. And they took the precaution of assassinating his brother Robert at a later point. The immediate effect was to go into the Green Movement of the 1970s and into economic games, which was destroying the United States economy. It's been destroying it ever since, despite the efforts of some people to change that. So what we're on the road to is the same kind of thing. We're going through a reenactment of the sequence of World War I. It's a different schedule, different events, but the package is the same. The British start a set of war. The British Empire starts a war. It spreads it. It involves destruction, large-scale destruction of certain parts of the world. Germany was the first target to be destroyed. That was the intention. And it never really fully recovered from that ever since. France is also similarly destroyed now today, virtually destroyed. Spain and Portugal are now being crippled. Greece, unspeakable area. Italy is about to go into the same thing. So this is the process that's underway. It's a known process. The fact is, here's the problem. We have recently, and it broke out under George Bush Jr. In his first term. I warned about it on the 3rd of January of that year. Said it was going to happen, that a terror operation was going to break out during that year, which would lead to a great conflict. That was 9/11. Now, look at what 9/11 was, and then look at what has happened in Benghazi, in Syria. You have to understand what is really going on here. You can't just make comments, good or bad or so forth. You've got to understand a process, not a sequence of events, but a process. It's a process based on the tomfoolery of the average citizen, the average head of government. The average politician is a fool. In this matter, is a fool. They think that this is the issue. You've got a conflict. Well, this is the issue. It is not the issue. The issue is the damn foolishness of the people who believe it's the issue. Because the way these things are done, they're based on the fact that the human being acts like a chicken. They don't know where the future is going. They're pecking for worms in the ground and mistaking the fact that the butcher is coming to get them. And that's the nature of these kinds of things. And that's what's happening to us. The British started how? They started what became World War I. They started it in 1890. And it was built up with crises in France, a change in the character of the French government by assassinating the president of France, and similar kinds of things, going into what? The next phase was in 1893, you had the launching of a war by Britain in alliance with Japan against China. That led into the 1905 war of the same forces with Russia in the eastern part. That went into the 1905 revolution as such. That went into all the other kinds of wars, including Balkan wars, which were spread, and suddenly one day, with all these stupid people and politicians and press saying, "Oh, the problem's going to be solved." 2 days later, the drums of August, World War I broke open. That continued. It never went away. The machinery of process of warfare under imperial conditions continued. We have been living under those kinds of imperial conditions, regressions, resurgences, and so forth, up to the present time. And that's where the problem lies. That's what you have to think in terms of. Don't try to think in terms of action-reaction. The problem of the typical American, like the typical European, very few of them understand the process. They think in terms that what we know is what we experience. If it didn't happen to us, we don't know it. You find, for example, all forecasting, economic forecasting, by the typical idiot, the typical official editing idiot. They all believe that this is the way things work. That it comes to a breaking point, it builds up to a breaking point. It doesn't take into account the fact that somebody who's looking at the future rather than the present is saying what's being done in the present is assuring us of what is going to happen down the line. So that the way world wars happen, they happen like in the case of Bismarck. They start with a small incident, but at the beginning of that incident itself, the intention is by imperial forces to get to a general warfare. We are in the same thing now. Right now, what happened in Libya, the President of the United States is a traitor. What did he do? He went into Libya, or Syria rather. He went into Syria, or Libya first, and then Syria. He went in there to start a war. Now, the President of the United States has no authorization to conduct a war without the consent of Congress. So this president committed an act of treason by conjoining with a foreign power to connive against the United States itself, the United States Constitution. He's a traitor to the United States. That's what this bum is. He's an accomplice of the same people that launched 9/11 in 2001. That operation was done by who? By Saudi Arabia and the British. 9/11 was done by Saudi Arabia and the British. And the key figure in the guy of picking some of these people who flew the planes against New York City and so forth was done by British. It was the BAE, a British-Saudi joint corporation, which organized the masses of money through oil deals and otherwise to conduct the attack on the United States in September of 2001. Immediately, the Bush administration and its people who ran it ordered the shutdown of any treatment of evidence showing the connection between the British and Saudis and 9/11, the original one. The same thing happened with the case of in North Africa, the same thing. An illegal war was pushed through on the basis of a British-Saudi operation. The entire Al-Qaeda operation is a British-Saudi operation in which the President of the United States is fully complicit, consciously implicit. That's what's going on. And we, like damn fools, are talking about the news, which is reported from yesterday's newspaper, and telling us that's the future. But the consequences of what the action is, the consequences of what's happening in Syria, for example, in the Syrian area, it's the same thing. There is no reason, no justified reason, and only a criminal or a fool inside the United Nations could ever condone that operation. These are Saudi-controlled forces operating under these terms, which are running and creating this war in Syria and adjoining areas. They are the criminals. Now we have the United States and the British monarchy and so forth are all promoting an illegal war, an immoral war against Syria, using in forces which are, in fact, agents of the Saudis. And the whole thing is still the same Saudi-British operation, which was the original 9/11. These forces are actually the same. These are the enemies of the United States. They're the enemies of civilization. And people are trying to say we have to negotiate with them. Well, yes, you do have to negotiate with them, because you don't have the backing to crush them. These people should be arrested and cleared out. They're nothing but mass murderers. They're criminals. They belong in a criminal court for their treatment. But we, like our gutless wonders that many of our politicians are doing nothing about what is a completely known crime. Nobody of competence in the international intelligence services doubts that. Any competent intelligence service knows this whole thing is a farce. And they know that the President of the United States is actually a traitor to the United States. That's what you're dealing with. The question is, do you have the guts to deal with it? On the first level of guts, do you have the guts to admit that you know that you don't reject it? And secondly, that you insist, as a citizen of whatever country, you insist that that be understood in those terms. Why are we allowing people for so long, beginning with an infamous creature from Britain, in going into wars which are illegal, as in the Second Iraq War? The Second Iraq War set off a whole pattern of this, which led into what happened with 9/11 and similar kinds of things. And you had the installation of Obama as president was done by these factions in Britain. He was nothing but a piece of meat used by the Queen of England. That's what all he was. Tony Blair, one of the worst skunks that ever slithered across the landscape. But these are the facts we have to deal with. Now, the way we try to deal with them, diplomatically, in other words, strategically, you try to handle the problem. But you apply the exact amount of force to handle the problem without actually provoking more than you intend to take on. If nations would agree with Russia and China on this issue, we could solve it rather quickly. But you have to admit that what the problem is, you have an imperial British Saudi alliance against, in fact, the United States. Because it was that interest in the United States and Britain which launched the original 9/11, which was a British Saudi operation, conducted inside the United States under the direction of the Saudi ambassador to Washington. So in this time, when you get into this area, you're not talking about nice explanations. You're talking about hard realities. And if you want to be able to deal with these things on the level of politics, you've got to understand the politics that are required of you to deal with these kinds of problems. And what we want is an agreement among other nations. If Russia and China are in agreement with the United States government, these problems will very quickly go away. The drug problem will not go away that simply. But the strategic situation, the strategic threat, which is a palpable threat right now, that can be taken away.